The room was already full when it happened. People were talking, moving, waiting for something more interesting to begin. It wasn't a place where anyone expected surprises. It felt routine, predictable, almost forgettable. And then, without any announcement or attention, someone stepped forward toward the piano, not confidently, not dramatically. Just quietly. It didn't look important. In fact, most people barely noticed at first. A few glanced over, then looked away again. There was no excitement in the air. No reason to believe something special was about to happen. It felt like just another moment that would pass without meaning. There was a short pause, like the room itself was deciding whether this moment mattered or not. A few people exchanged looks. Some small smiles appeared, the kind that come from low expectations. No one said anything out loud, but the feeling was clear. This wasn't going to be anything special. It didn't feel like it deserved attention. It felt like something you could ignore. Still, a decision was made. Not a big one, not an important one, just enough to allow it. 35 minutes. Tatese? All. It sounded like more than it really was. In a place like this, time moved quickly. 35 minutes could disappear before anyone even realized it. For most people in the room, it meant nothing. Just a small gap in time before something better came along. Some didn't even expect it to last that long. There was no applause. No welcome. No introduction. Just space and a ticking clock that no one could hear, but somehow everyone could feel. The piano stood there, quiet and still, like it had seen moments like this before, like it already knew how this would go. The air felt normal, unchanged. Conversations didn't fully stop. A few people kept talking softly, not even trying to hide it. Others checked their phones, waiting for something worth their attention. And then, finally, the first note. It wasn't loud. It wasn't powerful. It didn't demand anything from anyone. It was soft, almost careful. The kind of sound that could easily be missed if you weren't listening, and most people weren't. The note faded into the room without changing much. It didn't turn heads. It didn't stop conversations. It didn't create silence. Another note followed. Then, another. Still simple. Still quiet. Still nothing that made people feel like they needed to pay attention. In fact, it almost confirmed what they already believed. This wasn't going to be anything special. It felt slow, uncertain, like someone trying to find their place, and not quite getting there. A small laugh came from somewhere in the room. Not loud, not cruel, but noticeable. It spread just a little, like a ripple that didn't need much energy to move. A few more smiles appeared. Some people didn't even try to hide their reactions anymore, because from the outside, it looked ordinary. There was no big entrance, no strong beginning, no moment that made people stop and think, wait, this is different. Instead, it felt like something they had seen before, something they didn't need to focus on, something that would pass. And yet, the playing didn't stop. The notes continued, steady, patient, not rushing, not forcing anything, just moving forward, one moment at a time. Almost like it didn't care about the room, almost like it wasn't trying to impress anyone at all. But still, no one was paying real attention. The sound stayed in the background, blending into the noise of the room. Conversations rose and fell over it. Chairs moved. Small distractions continued. Life inside the room didn't pause for it. And maybe that was the point where most people made their decision. They decided it wasn't worth watching. They decided it wasn't worth listening to. They decided it wasn't going to matter, because nothing about the beginning suggested otherwise. The pace was slow. The feeling was unclear. It didn't grab attention. It didn't demand silence. It didn't give anyone a reason to stop what they were doing. It just existed. And sometimes, that's all it takes for people to look away. But the time kept moving. Minute by minute, second by second. Those 35 minutes were already starting to disappear. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, the way time always does. And still, nothing had changed in the room. Not really. Or at least, that's what it seemed like. Because somewhere between those simple notes, something very small was beginning to shift. Not enough for everyone to notice. Not enough to change the whole room. But enough to exist. A slight difference in rhythm. A little more control in the sound. A feeling that wasn't there before. It was subtle. Easy to miss. And most people did miss it. But not all of them. A few eyes stayed a little longer than before. Not fully focused. But not completely ignoring it either. Like something in the sound had caught their attention without asking for it. Still, no one said anything. Because it was too early to be sure. Too early to believe that this could turn into something more. So the room stayed the same. Mostly half interested, half distracted. Caught somewhere between paying attention and not caring at all. And right there, in that uncertain space, the moment continued to build. Slowly, quietly, without forcing anything. No big change, not yet, just a feeling. Barely noticeable, starting to grow. And the clock kept ticking because those 35 minutes were still running, and no one in that room, not a single person, truly understood what they were about to witness. The first few minutes passed quietly, almost unnoticed. People talked among themselves, still not paying much attention. A few chuckles broke out here, and they're not mean-spirited, but the kind of laughter that comes from seeing someone unsure, someone who doesn't quite fit the situation. It wasn't that they wanted to laugh. Exactly. It was more like a reflex. The music seemed small, hesitant, almost awkward. The piano didn't dominate the room. The notes didn't demand attention. They simply existed. And in that quiet hesitance, the room found room for amusement. Some of the laughter was nervous. People weren't certain what they were seeing or hearing, and laughter felt like the easiest way to respond. Others smiled knowingly, like they had seen this type of thing before. Maybe it was the posture, the tentative movements, the way the hands trembled over the keys. To anyone glancing quickly, it didn't look like a performance at all. It looked like someone experimenting, unsure of what they were doing, making small mistakes, testing the waters. And so the room reacted. Eyes shifted. Heads tilted. A few whispered comments escaped quietly, just loud enough to be noticed by the ones nearby. The pressure started to build. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in that quiet, subtle kind of tension that everyone feels when a small moment suddenly becomes a public. Those 35 minutes that had seemed like a generous window now felt heavy, almost suffocating. People watching could sense it, even if they didn't admit it to themselves. Time is strange, like that one moment, it's nothing. The next moment, it's everything. And for this one person, the ticking clock became a constant reminder. There was no second chance. 35 minutes was all there was, and he could feel it. The weight of the room, the subtle glances, the small laughter it, all pressed down on him. The notes he played carried more than sound. They carried expectation, doubt, curiosity, disbelief. Every key he pressed was measured against the quiet judgment of the room. For anyone else, that might have been enough to break them, to make them falter, to make them stop altogether. But he didn't stop. Not yet. He just kept playing, slow and careful, almost hesitant, letting the music speak before his hands fully trusted themselves. People laughed again. It wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. A small, dismissive chuckle from the back, a soft snicker from one side. Perhaps it was the uncertainty in the notes. Perhaps it was the small pauses that seemed to last too long. There was a moment when the laughter almost felt contagious, spreading subtly through the room, as if everyone was waiting for the joke to fully land. But the music didn't waver. Not a single note faltered. It continued, steady, patient, as though it knew something that the room didn't. And slowly, that's when the first hint of tension emerged. The laughter that had once felt light started to shift. There was a pause between the notes, a subtle change in rhythm, almost imperceptible, but enough to make people stop mid-smile. Heads lifted slightly, eyes moved from side to side, trying to understand what was happening. The music didn't demand attention yet, but it began to hint at the possibility that this wasn't just another ordinary attempt. Something was growing beneath the surface. For some in the room, the shift came as a surprise. They had laughed, yes, but they had done so with confidence. They had assumed they knew exactly what this would be. A small, quiet moment to fill the time. An unremarkable attempt that wouldn't last, wouldn't matter. And now, that certainty was beginning to fade. The laughter faltered. The whispers ceased. People weren't sure what to feel anymore. The pressure in the room became almost tangible. 35 minutes might have been generous, but it felt like a countdown to judgment. The ones who had laughed first now found themselves caught in a strange, awkward silence. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't thought it would matter. And yet, here they were, watching, waiting, uncertain. The small moments of imperfection that had invited laughter before were now almost magnetic, drawing attention rather than deflecting it. And still, the music remained humble. There was no bravado, no attempt to impress. Every note was deliberate, but careful. The piano itself seemed to respond, carrying a depth that slowly seeped into the room, like water moving into cracks in stone. People called in tea. Coin immediate, but something inside them began to shift. What had been amusement was slowly turning into curiosity. And curiosity, once it catches hold, is hard to shake. He could feel the tension as clearly as the music under his fingers. Every glance, every suppressed smile, every soft whisper traveled to him across the room. And yet, he didn't stop. He didn't rush. He didn't try to force a reaction. He simply let the music flow, letting the small notes grow gradually, as though they were stretching to reach something bigger. And that, in itself, began to command attention. The laughter started to fade, not because the room had fully realized what was happening, but because it couldn't continue. The music had begun to hold it back, gently, subtly, without force. People were beginning to lean forward, who slightly, not wanting to miss the next sound, the next movement. The pressure that had weighed on him was now mirrored in the room itself. Every listener, in their own way, was holding their breath, waiting for something to emerge from those hesitant beginnings. And in those moments, something unexpected happened. Confidence began to grow not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, steadily. The hesitant notes became more assured. The pauses between them became meaningful rather than awkward. The music no longer invited laughter. It invited attention. People shifted in their seats, leaning in, focusing, their previous amusement, replaced by a sense of anticipation. The energy in the room changed, almost imperceptibly, but undeniably. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. The room, once full of distractions, had become a space of quiet observation. People realized that what they had laughed at only moments before might be leading somewhere they hadn't imagined. The small chuckles and whispers had vanished, replaced by an almost reverent silence. Not because the music demanded respect yet, but because it hinted at the possibility of something extraordinary. He didn't look up. He didn't pause. He let the music carry him forward, letting every note build slowly on the one before. And thus it did. The laughter that had once dominated the room now felt like a distant memory. The very thing that had caused amusement now seemed insignificant, almost foolish in hindsight. People were no longer laughing. They were watching. They were listening. And they were waiting, as the music began to transform from something ordinary into something that might just be unforgettable. The pressure of the 35 minutes was still there. The clock continued its silent march. And yet, something remarkable had already begun. The energy in the room had shifted. The initial amusement, the doubt, the whispers, all of it had been replaced by attention. Curiosity had taken hold. People wanted to see what would happen next. They wanted to witness whether this small, hesitant moment could turn into something extraordinary. And in that tension, in that silent anticipation, the story of these 35 minutes really began to unfold. The first spark came almost unnoticed. At first, it was subtle, barely distinguishable from the steady flow of notes that had filled the room before. People had been quiet for a few moments, leaning forward, sensing that something might be happening, though they weren't sure what. The music had shifted slightly, as though it had gained a pulse, a rhythm that was no longer hesitant. It was the kind of change that didn't scream for attention but demanded it quietly. Like a light flickering in the corner of your eye, you couldn't look away, even if you tried. No one clapped. No one moved forward. The piano didn't suddenly roar. It didn't dominate the space with volume or speed. But there was a difference now, and it was tangible. A few heads tilted. Eyebrows rose slightly. People who had laughed before caught themselves stopping mid-thought, unsure what had just happened. There was an unspoken agreement in the room. Something was changing. Something small, yes, but enough to pull the attention of everyone present. It began with a change in tempo, subtle but intentional. The hesitant pauses that had marked the earlier minutes were gone. In their place, there was a flow, smooth and deliberate, as if the music had found its own path. Each note led naturally to the next. It wasn't flashy or overbearing. It was precise, confident, yet still gentle. That gentle confidence was the first spark that began to ignite curiosity in the room. People were drawn in without realizing it. They leaned forward instinctively, curious to see if the music could hold this new promise. The hands of the piano moved differently now. No longer tentative or unsure, the fingers glided across the keys, light and decisive. The earlier nervousness had transformed into a quiet command of the instrument. Each note felt intentional, purposeful, yet effortless. It was a strange combination. Calm authority, paired with a sense of vulnerability. People noticed it, even if they didn't understand why. Something about it felt real, authentic. It wasn't about showing off. It was about creating, about speaking, without words. Whispers began to die out. The soft laughter that had filled the space before was completely gone. People were no longer talking to each other. They were listening. Some closed their eyes for a moment, letting the sound move through them. Others leaned slightly closer, as if trying to catch something they couldn't fully describe. The room, which had been so full of doubt and light amusement, had shifted. There was tension now, yes, but it was the kind of tension that draws people in rather than pushes them away. People were hooked. And didn't even realize it. The music itself seemed to respond to the room. In the beginning, it had been careful, quiet, almost testing the space. But now, as the spark of confidence grew, the piano's voice grew with it. Not in loudness, but in character. There was nuance in every note, a depth that had been absent before. The soft, hesitant beginnings had evolved into something that suggested a story unspoken story unfolding in real time. Listeners didn't need to understand it fully. They only needed to feel it, and feel it they did. Somewhere along the way, a subtle smile began to appear on faces around the room. Not a laugh, not the kind of amusement that comes from ridicule. This was something different. This was recognition of skill, of presence, of something special emerging from a moment that had seemed ordinary. It was the kind of smile that forms slowly, almost unconsciously, when people realize that what they had dismissed is turning out to be far more than they expected. The first spark grew into a small fire as the music continued. Patterns began to emerge in the notes' gentle rises, careful falls, moments that lingered just long enough to make the heart pause. It wasn't about speed or complexity. It was about timing, precision, and emotion. Each phrase connected naturally to the next, building a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. People in the room felt it without understanding exactly why. Their focus sharpened. Their attention was caught and held. Something that had seemed simple had transformed into something mesmerizing. The pressure of the 35 minutes hung in the air, still present, but no longer oppressive. It had become a force that pushed the music forward, giving it urgency without haste. Every passing second mattered now. There was no room for hesitation. The earlier doubts that had allowed laughter to exist were gone. Now there was only expectation not from the audience, exactly, but from the music itself. It demanded that each note be true, that each moment be earned, and in response, the hands at the piano delivered. A noticeable shift happened when a particularly delicate sequence of notes emerged. It was subtle, almost fragile, and yet it drew the room in completely. People stopped moving. People stopped breathing quietly. Some tilted their heads slightly, listening intently. The sound filled the space in a way that was both quiet and powerful at the same time. There was no spectacle, no dramatic flair, yet It was impossible to ignore. The spark had grown into something undeniable. The moment was no longer ordinary. It had begun to feel extraordinary. Even those who had doubted from the beginning now found themselves leaning in. The initial amusement, the laughter that had come so easily, had disappeared. The spark had transformed their perception. What they had assumed would be trivial had become captivating. The music had demanded their attention through nothing more than presence, patience, and the quiet mastery of small details. It wasn't over yet, but it had already proven that it was something different. People began to notice the subtle reactions in each other. Heads turned. Eyes widened slightly. A quiet intake of breath could be heard in the back. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that something remarkable was unfolding. The spark, subtle and almost invisible at first, had begun to spread through the room, igniting attention, curiosity, and anticipation. The audience was no longer passive. They were engaged, waiting to see what would come next. And the music responded. Wheat acno. Each delicate rise and fall. The story grew. It was no longer simply a sequence of keys being pressed. It was expression. It was emotion. It was a narrative without words. People could feel the tension, the hope, the dedication all embedded in the careful performance. They could sense that what was happening was the product of practice, patience, and perhaps even a lifetime of quiet preparation. And yet, it felt immediate, alive, present. A quiet "oh" began to settle in the room. Not everyone understood why, and that didn't matter. The spark had worked its magic. People were no longer thinking about laughter, judgment, or expectation. They were listening. They were watching. They were experiencing. Something that had begun as a small, uncertain moment had now captured the attention of everyone in the space. The hands at the piano never faltered. They moved with confidence now, building on the spark that had ignited moments earlier. Each phrase carried more meaning. Each note contributed to a larger picture. The hesitant beginning had transformed into deliberate artistry. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't need to be. Its strength lay in the subtlety, in the patient growth of music that could hold attention without demanding it. And then, somewhere near the middle of the 35 minutes, something clicked. Not with a loud note, not with an abrupt change. It was a quiet realization among the listeners. The spark had become a flame. They could feel it. They didn't need to speak about it. They didn't need to applaud or react. The music itself had created a moment of shared understanding, drawing everyone into the same emotional space. The room that had once been filled with casual observers and skeptical smiles was now connected through something far more powerful. The emergence of undeniable talent. At that point, even the smallest movements mattered. Every subtle pause, every delicate emphasis, every gentle crescendo contributed to a growing narrative that no one could ignore. The spark had proven its power. It had changed the mood, shifted attention, and drawn everyone in. The room was no longer neutral. The audience had been captured, held in a quiet but compelling grip, and the music, patient and deliberate, had done it without spectacle, without force, simply by being authentic. It was a turning point, though no one knew it yet. The spark that had begun so subtly now carried the weight of possibility. People who had doubted began to feel anticipation. People who had laughed before found themselves holding their breath, and the pianist, aware of the growing presence in the room, continued without haste, without distraction, building from the spark that had begun almost unnoticed. By the time a few minutes had passed since that small ignition, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The spark had become undeniable. It was in the posture of the listeners, in the quiet intensity of their gaze, in the small, unconscious nods that began to appear. The moment was no longer ordinary. It was charged with expectation. And all of this had happened without a single dramatic gesture, without a single forced attempt to impress. The music had simply found its spark, and the spark had grown into a small fire that touched everyone in the room. The turning point had arrived. The spark was alive, and from there was no going back. The audience had been drawn in. The laughter was gone. The skepticism had faded, and in its place, there was something new. The beginning of wonder. By now, the room was no longer the same. What had once been filled with quiet distractions, soft laughter, and half-hearted attention had transformed into something completely different. The air felt heavier, but not in a negative way. It was the kind of weight that comes when something real is happening, something people don't want to interrupt. No one was talking anymore. No one was checking their phone. Every eye was locked on the piano. Every mind pulled into the moment without resistance. The music had fully taken over. It wasn't just sound anymore. It had become a presence, something alive, something moving through the room, touching every person in a different way. Each note carried emotion now. Not forced emotion, not exaggerated, just real, raw feeling. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that people feel before they even understand it. The hands moved faster now, but not carelessly. There was control in every movement, precision in every transition. It wasn't about showing skill. It was about telling something deeper. The rhythm had grown stronger, more confident, and yet it still held that same quiet honesty from the beginning. That balance made it impossible to ignore. People leaned forward without realizing it. Some sat completely still, afraid that even the smallest movement might break the moment. Others watched with wide eyes, as if trying to understand how something so simple at the start had turned into something this powerful. There were no more doubts left in the room. Those had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by something much stronger: respect. And then, the music shifted again. This time, it wasn't subtle. A deeper tone entered, richer and more intense. It felt like the story inside the music had reached a point where it could no longer stay quiet. The notes carried weight now, each one landing with purpose. The pace picked up slightly, not rushed, but urgent, like something important was being said, something that couldn't wait any longer. The energy in the room changed instantly. You could feel it. Hearts beating a little faster, breaths becoming shorter, attention tightening even more. It was no longer just listening, Meat was experiencing. The earlier silence had been curious. This silence was different. This was deep, emotional, almost overwhelming. The kind of silence where people forget where they are, where time stops feeling real, where nothing exists except the sound filling the space. And still, the music kept building. Layer by layer, note by note, it grew stronger. Not louder for the sake of noise, but louder with meaning. The melody expanded, reaching further, pulling more emotion out of every second. It felt like everything that had been held back in the beginning was finally being released. Somewhere in the room, someone blinked back tears. Not because they were sad, but because something inside them had been touched in a way they didn't expect. Others swallowed quietly, their expressions soft, completely focused. No one spoke. No one reacted loudly. But inside, everyone was feeling something. And that was the power of it. It wasn't about impressing the room anymore. It was about connecting with it. The music reached a peak, strong, emotional, undeniable. The hands moved with full confidence now. No hesitation left. No one said. Every motion was clear, every note intentional. It felt like everything had led to this exact moment. The earlier doubts, the laughter, the quiet beginnings, all of it had built toward this. And now, it was impossible to look away. Even the people who had laughed the most at the start were now completely still. Their expressions had changed the most. Where there had once been amusement, there was now disbelief. Not loud disbelief, not dramatic, but quiet realization. They hadn't expected this. Not even close. The music soft suddenly. Not as an ending, but as a pause, a breath in the middle of something bigger. The shift was so smooth, so controlled, that it pulled the room even deeper into the moment. After everything that had just built up, this softness felt even more powerful. It gave people space to feel what had just happened, and to prepare for what was coming next. Because it wasn't over yet, the final build began. Slow at first, almost gently like the beginning, but different this time. There was no hesitation anymore. No uncertainty. This was deliberate. Controlled. Strong in a quiet way that didn't need to prove itself. The notes began to rise again. Step by step, the intensity returned. But now, it carried everything that had come before it: the growth, the emotion, the connection. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was a story reaching its final chapter. People leaned in even closer. You could feel the anticipation, Everyone knew something was coming. They didn't know exactly what, but they could feel it building. That rare moment where an entire room shares the same silent expectation. No one moving, no one speaking. Just waiting, and then the final sequence began. Clear. Strong. Unforgettable. The notes flowed with complete confidence. Faster now, but still precise. There was no struggle, no doubt, no hesitation. Just pure expression. It felt effortless, even though everyone knew it wasn't. This was the moment. The moment where everything connected. The beginning, the doubt, the laughter, the slow build, spark. All of it came together here. The music filled every corner of the room. It wasn't just heard, it was felt. Deep, powerful, emotional. The kind of moment people don't forget, even if they can't explain why. Somewhere, someone held their breath. Another person closed their eyes. Someone else just stared, completely still, not wanting it to end. And just when it felt like it couldn't go any higher, it stopped. Not abruptly, not sharply, but perfectly. The final note lingered in the air for a brief moment, then faded. And then silence. Not empty silence, full silence. The kind that feels louder than any sound. No one moved, no one spoke. For a few seconds, the entire room just sat there, frozen in the moment, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how something that started so small, so uncertain, had turned into something this powerful. The clock was still ticking somewhere in the background, but it didn't matter anymore, because those 35 minutes had just become something much bigger, something no one in that room would ever forget. For a moment, nothing happened. No sound, no movement, no reaction, just silence. Not the empty kind, but a heavy, full silence. Like the room itself needed time to understand what had just happened. It felt as if everything had paused, as if no one wanted to break that moment too quickly. People sat still, their eyes fixed, their thoughts catching up slowly. What they had just experienced didn't feel ordinary. It didn't feel like something that would simply pass and be forgotten. It felt deeper than that. Something that stayed. Something that settled quietly inside them. A few people blinked, almost like they were coming out of a dream. Others looked around, not to speak, but to see if everyone else felt the same way. And they did. You could see it in their expressions: quiet disbelief, soft realization, a kind of respect that hadn't been there before. The same people who had smiled earlier, who had laughed without thinking, were now completely still. No one was laughing anymore, because now they understood what they had missed at the beginning. Then, without warning, it started. A single clap broke the silence. It was soft at first, almost unsure, like the person didn't know if it was the right moment. But then another clap followed, and then another, and suddenly the entire room came alive. Applause filled the space, strong and real, not forced or polite, but honest. It grew louder and louder, echoing through the room with a kind of energy that couldn't be held back. People began to stand, slowly at first, then more and more, until it turned into a full standing ovation. Some clapped harder, some shook their heads in disbelief, some just stood there, smiling quietly, still trying to process everything. This wasn't just appreciation, it was recognition. Recognition of something they hadn't a say in before, something they hadn't believed in when it first began. And now, standing there, clapping, they couldn't ignore it anymore. The applause didn't fade quickly. It stayed. It continued. It carried emotion with it. It was the kind of applause that comes when people feel something real, something unexpected. And in that moment, it wasn't just about music. It was about everything that had happened in between: the doubt, the laughter, the slow beginning, the quiet growth, and the powerful ending. Some people lowered their eyes for a second, almost feeling a quiet kind of regret, not because they had done something wrong, but because they remembered how they had reacted at the start. The small smiles, the whispers, the lack of attention at all came back to them now, and it felt different. But no one said anything. They didn't need to. The applause was enough. It said everything that words couldn't. As the clapping slowly began to settle, the energy in the room didn't disappear. It stayed, floating in the air, in the way people looked at each other, in the way they looked at the piano. It wasn't just an instrument anymore. It had become something more, something connected to a moment that had changed the entire room. People sat down again, but they weren't the same. Their posture was different, their expressions softer, more thoughtful. Some began to talk quietly, but the conversations had changed. They weren't casual anymore. They were reflective, almost careful, as if people were trying to explain something they couldn't fully understand. Others didn't speak at all. They just sat there, holding on to the feeling, letting it stay a little longer. And somewhere in that quiet, a simple truth became clear. It was never just about the 35 minutes. It wasn't about the time itself, because time alone doesn't create something like this. What mattered was what happened inside those minutes. The patience, the focus, the decision to keep going, even when no one was paying attention, even when people were laughing. That was the difference. That was what changed everything. Because most people would have stopped. Most people would have felt the pressure, heard the doubt, and walked away. But this time, that didn't happen, and because of that, the outcome became something no one expected. The room that once felt ordinary now felt meaningful. The same people who had ignored the beginning were now holding on to the ending. And those 35 minutes, which had seemed small and unimportant at first, had turned into something that would stay with them long after they left. People would walk out of that room and go back to their normal lives. They would return to their routines, their daily distractions, their usual patterns. But something would be different, because they would remember this moment. Maybe not every detail, not every note, but the feeling, the shift, the way everything changed right in front of them. And maybe that's what made it powerful. Not perfection, not performance, but the journey. The way something so simple could grow into something so meaningful. The way people could go from laughing to listening, from doubting to believing, all within the same space, within the same time. It showed something important, something real, that sometimes people judge too quickly. Sometimes they decide too early, before the moment has even had a chance to become something more. And when they do, they miss what's coming next. But in this case, they didn't miss it. They saw it. They felt it. And by the end, they understood. Because sometimes, all it takes is one chance, one uninterrupted moment, to prove something no one believed in at the start, to turn doubt into respect, to turn silence into applause, to take something ordinary and turn it into something unforgettable. And those 35 minutes did exactly that. They didn't just pass. They stayed. They left something behind, not on the piano, not in the room, but in the people who were there. And that is what made them matter, because real moments don't end when the sound fades. They stay, quietly, long after everything goes silent.